At 2 hours before midnight in Washington, the countdown had already started. 50% tariffs on $20 billion of Canadian goods were set to hit at 12:01 a.m. And inside the U.S. Trade Representative's office, officials were still negotiating with their Canadian counterparts, trying to find a way out. That was 3 days ago. As of this week, the story took a sharp turn, and it did not end the way the White House wanted it to. This is the story of how a tariff plan built around one of the oldest and most obscure trade laws in American history ran directly into a loophole that had been sitting in plain sight for years. A loophole so structurally embedded in North American trade that even a president determined to close it could only chip away at its edges. And this week, in Washington and in Ottawa, that fight reached its most consequential moment yet. Let's start with what just happened, because it's the freshest part of this story, and it's the part most people are still catching up on. According to Al Jazeera, trade negotiators from the United States and Canada spent 3 days locked in talks in Washington, working against a deadline set personally by President Trump. When that deadline expired at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time this past Saturday, the two sides had not reached an agreement. The result, the United States actually imposed 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney responded immediately, saying his country would match the new tariffs, in his words, dollar for dollar. He also noted that in recent weeks, Canada had made what he called real progress towards securing better terms with Washington, but that the progress had not translated into a final deal. That single moment, talks collapsing just hours before a deadline, then tariffs actually taking effect, is the headline. But to understand why this happened and why so many analysts are calling this a structural failure rather than a one-off dispute, you have to go back and look at how we got here. Because this fight didn't start last week. It started more than a year and a half ago, and it has been building, pausing, and reigniting ever since. Rewind to February of 2025. President Trump announced sweeping new tariffs on Canadian goods, 25% on most imports, 10% specifically on Canadian energy products. The stated justification at the time was the flow of fentanyl across the northern border into the United States, even though data available at the time showed only a small fraction of fentanyl seized in the U.S. actually originated from Canada. Canada did not sit still. Ottawa responded with retaliatory tariffs of its own, first on $30 billion of American goods, then escalating to $155 billion within 3 weeks, according to reporting on the timeline of the trade war. This was the opening shot in what would become a defining economic conflict between two of the closest trading partners in the world. Over the following months, the fight widened. Steel, aluminum, automobiles, lumber, sector after sector got pulled into the dispute, with both the U.S. federal government and Canadian provincial governments scrambling to respond, some with new tariffs, others with support programs to cushion the blow to local industries. Markets felt the volatility. Diplomatic relations, long considered some of the steadiest in the world, started to fray in ways that surprised even veteran trade officials in both capitals. By August of 2025, the pressure ratcheted up again. Trump sent a letter to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, posted publicly on his Truth Social platform, announcing that starting August 1st, the United States would charge Canada a 35% tariff on Canadian products, separate from the sector-specific tariffs already in place. In that letter, Trump again pointed to fentanyl and added a broader complaint that Canada maintained what he called unsustainable trade barriers, contributing to a persistent U.S. trade deficit. He warned that if Canada raised its own retaliatory tariffs in response, the U.S. would simply add that increase on top of the 35%. Here's where the story gets interesting, and here's where the loophole in the title starts to take real shape. Despite all of this, despite months of escalating tariffs, despite letters threatening even harsher measures, something strange kept happening throughout 2025 and into 2026. The vast majority of Canadian goods entering the United States kept avoiding those tariffs almost entirely. According to Global News and the Canadian press, U.S. Census Bureau data showed that as of July 2026, 90% of Canadian goods were still entering the United States, completely tariff-free. 90%, despite a blanket tariff rate sitting at 35% on paper. How is that possible? The answer is the loophole at the center of this entire saga. Compliance with the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known as CUSMA in Canada and USMCA in the United States. Under the terms of that agreement, goods that meet specific rules of origin requirements are exempt from the broader tariffs the Trump administration was trying to impose. Canadian exporters who could prove their goods qualified as CUSMA compliant simply sailed past the tariff wall that was supposed to be squeezing their economy. Trade lawyer William Pellerin, speaking to Global News, explained that CUSMA compliance can be complex to prove, but that Canadian businesses had become increasingly sophisticated at documenting it, effectively turning the trade agreement itself into a shield against the tariff campaign. Tony Stillo, director of Canada Economics at Oxford Economics, called this exemption a genuine salvation for the Canadian economy throughout 2025, but he also warned that this saving grace was at risk heading into a scheduled 2026 review of the CUSMA agreement, a review that could either reinforce that exemption or strip it away entirely. So, while headlines through 2025 focused on sweeping tariff announcements, the reality on the ground in Ottawa and in Washington was far messier. Formal tariff rates kept climbing on paper, but the actual flow of goods across the border kept finding its way through the CUSMA exemption. It was, in effect, exactly the kind of fatal loophole this story's title refers to. Not a clever trick discovered in some backroom negotiation, but a structural feature of the trade relationship itself that undercut the entire premise of a blanket tariff strategy. While the CUSMA exemption was quietly shielding most Canadian trade, one specific corner of this fight played out in full public view, with a level of political theater that's worth walking through, because it shows just how volatile this relationship became. In February 2025, Trump announced 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from every country, including Canada, according to Global News, removing exemptions that had existed for Canada under a 2019 bilateral agreement. Canada responded on March 13th with reciprocal tariffs covering nearly $30 billion of American goods, according to a government briefing document from Global Affairs Canada, hitting steel, aluminum, and a wide range of other U.S. products. Then came one of the more chaotic weeks of the entire trade war. Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to Michigan, New York, and Minnesota as a retaliatory measure. Trump responded on Truth Social by threatening to double the steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada to 50%, warning, in his words, that Canada would pay a financial price so big it would be read about in history books for years to come. A statement that, according to CBS News, sent U.S. stock markets tumbling that same day. Within hours, Ford agreed to suspend Ontario's electricity surcharge after what he described as a productive conversation with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and Lutnick then confirmed to CBS News that the threatened 50% doubling was off the table, with steel and aluminum tariffs settling back at 25%. Ford, notably, took a considerably more combative public posture throughout this period than Prime Minister Carney did, at one point publicly urging Carney to match Trump's tariffs dollar for dollar months before that phrase became Carney's own language this past week, and accusing the federal government of, in his words, getting steamrolled rather than standing up for Canada. Carney, for his part, consistently argued for restraint, telling reporters at the time that the steel and aluminum tariffs were a global action rather than one specifically targeting Canada, and that his government needed what he called some time, but not much, to pursue a broader negotiated settlement. That steel and aluminum tariff rate, notably, is one of the specific carve-outs excluded from the new Section 338 measures, meaning it has continued running on its own separate track throughout this entire year, layered on top of everything else. Then came a legal earthquake that reshaped the entire fight. In February 2026, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in a case called Learning Resources, Incorporated versus Trump, striking down several of the administration's sweeping tariffs that had been imposed using emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, commonly known as IEEPA. According to reporting reviewed for this script, the administration had used IEEPA to justify tariffs tied to two claimed emergencies: the flow of fentanyl and undocumented immigration from Canada, and broader trade deficits with multiple partners worldwide that had triggered the sweeping tariffs announced back in April of 2025. The Supreme Court disagreed with the administration's legal reasoning, ruling that IEEPA simply does not grant the president authority to create tariffs in this way. Any tariffs based specifically on that law were struck down. But, and this is critical, not everything disappeared. Tariffs built on different legal foundations, including sector-specific measures on Canadian automobiles, aluminum, steel, and lumber, were untouched by the ruling because they rested on separate legal authority. So the Trump administration lost a major tool, but it didn't lose the fight. It had to get creative with what legal levers remained. That creativity arrived on July 20th, 2026. And this is where the current chapter of the story truly begins. According to a fact sheet released by the White House and reporting from the law firm Wiley, President Trump signed 3 separate proclamations that day invoking a section of trade law that had not been used in roughly 70 years. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. This is an old, rarely touched piece of legislation that authorizes the president to impose tariffs of up to 50% on a country the administration determines is discriminating against American exports. And critically, it does not require a formal investigation to justify the measure, unlike more commonly used tariff authorities. Using Section 338, Trump imposed 50% tariffs on specific categories of Canadian goods: dairy products, alcoholic beverages, and motor vehicles, along with a wider basket that the White House fact sheet said ranged from wine to hockey sticks to cement. And here is the detail that made this move different from everything that came before it. These new Section 338 tariffs applied even to goods that qualified as CUSMA compliant. For the first time in this entire trade war, the administration had found a legal pathway that punched straight through the loophole that had shielded 90% of Canadian exports for over a year. The White House framed this explicitly as closing a fairness gap. In its fact sheet, the administration argued that Canada discriminates against American exports in three specific sectors: dairy, alcohol, and automobiles, pointing to Canadian tariffs and quotas on American-made cars that don't apply equally to vehicles from other countries, and arguing that Canada's quota system effectively pressures U.S. automakers to build factories in Canada rather than in the United States. The stated goal, according to the fact sheet, was to level what the administration called an unfair playing field for what it described as crucial American exports. It's worth slowing down on the dairy piece specifically, because it's been one of the most repeated and most misunderstood flashpoints in this entire trade war, going back years before this latest escalation. Canada's dairy sector operates under what's called a supply management system, a framework dating back to the 1970s that sets production quotas for Canadian farmers and uses tariffs to control how much foreign dairy enters the country, according to Global News. The way it actually works is this: a set volume of American dairy products can enter Canada duty-free under quotas, established through the CUSMA agreement. Only once imports exceed those quotas do the eye-popping tariff rates kick in, figures Trump has repeatedly cited, sometimes as high as 243% on milk, 245% on cheese, and 298% on butter, according to reporting from News Nation. Trump has referenced these numbers publicly for years, including at a G7 summit in Quebec back in 2018, where he told reporters Canada's tariffs were, in his words, very unfair to our farmers. But here's the nuance that's often left out, and it's worth stating clearly because sources disagree on how misleading Trump's framing actually is. According to a fact check, org analysis, American dairy exports to Canada have essentially never come close to hitting those quota thresholds in the first place, meaning U.S. dairy products have historically faced zero tariffs entering Canada in practice, not the triple-digit rates Trump frequently cites. Chuck Nicholson, an agricultural economics professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, told Fact Check, org that both countries actually use similar tariff rate quota systems for dairy, complicating the picture further. Meanwhile, food industry analyst Sylvain Charlebois of Dalhousie University, speaking to Reuters earlier in these negotiations, warned that Canada's supply management system remains such a politically sensitive issue domestically that, in his assessment, Trump is essentially one social media post away from creating political chaos inside Canada over this single topic. Prime Minister Carney, for his part, campaigned on a promise to keep supply management off the table in any negotiation with Washington, according to Global News reporting. A promise that puts him in a genuinely difficult political position now that the Section 338 tariffs specifically target the dairy sector he vowed to protect. The automotive piece of this works differently, but produces a similarly lopsided outcome, according to the White House's own fact sheet. Canada applies tariffs and quotas to American-made vehicles entering the Canadian market that don't apply equally to vehicles imported from other countries. And the administration argues that the way Canada administers those quotas effectively pressures American automakers into building manufacturing capacity inside Canada rather than expanding production on U.S. soil. Whether that amounts to deliberate discrimination, as the administration frames it, or simply reflects decades of integrated North American auto manufacturing supply chains, is very much a contested point between economists on both sides of the border. And it's a dispute that predates this specific round of tariffs by years. The scope was significant, but not unlimited. According to the Wiley Legal Alert, the new 50% duties did not apply to goods already covered by existing Section 232 tariffs, the ones covering steel, aluminum, and copper, nor did they apply to products covered under the World Trade Organization's Agreement on Trade in Civil Aircraft, or a handful of other specifically carved-out categories like energy, potash, fish, and certain critical minerals. Still, the fact sheet estimated the newly targeted goods represented close to $20 billion in annual trade, a meaningful slice of the overall U.S.-Canada trading relationship, which, according to NPR, totaled roughly $880 billion in combined goods and services trade last year alone. The tariffs were set to take effect 30 days after the proclamations were signed, landing on August 19, 2026. And this set up exactly the kind of high-stakes countdown that so often defines modern trade diplomacy. A hard deadline, enormous economic stakes on both sides of the border, and two governments racing the clock. As that deadline approached in mid-August, both countries dug in for one more round of talks. According to the Washington Post, industry executives and trade specialists following the negotiations described the two sides as, in the paper's words, inching closer to a deal that would avert the punitive 50% tariffs on products ranging from hockey sticks to wine to cement. Canadian officials, according to multiple outlets, had spent weeks in Washington trying to persuade the Trump administration to drop the new tariffs in exchange for trade concessions on the very issues the administration had cited: dairy, alcohol, and automobiles. Then, late on Tuesday, August 18th, with the deadline just hours away, came the twist that briefly made headlines around the world. President Trump announced on social media that he was pausing the 50% tariffs against Canada for a 3-day period. His stated reason, in his own words, was that Canada and the United States, subject to the finalization of documents, had reached a deal. Prime Minister Carney responded almost immediately with his own statement describing what he called intensive discussions with the United States aimed at resolving outstanding trade issues, and adding that substantial progress had been made, though he was careful to note that important work still remained. The following morning, speaking to reporters from the White House lawn, Trump elaborated slightly, though not with much specificity. According to the CNBC, he told reporters that Canada had essentially eliminated its tariffs on American goods, saying at one point that the U.S. now faced, in his words, no tariffs going into Canada anymore. He claimed Canadian tariffs would be, as he put it, non-existent for American farmers, though he did not specify exactly which duties he meant. When a reporter asked directly whether the U.S. would lower its own tariffs on Canadian automobiles as part of the arrangement, a top priority for Ottawa's negotiators throughout this entire fight, Trump gave a notably vague answer, saying only that the two sides were, in his phrase, doing certain things. He did not confirm specifics, and notably, he made no mention of a separate issue that had been floated earlier in the negotiations involving the Keystone XL pipeline. For a moment, it looked like this story might end quietly. A last-minute deal, tariffs avoided, both leaders claiming a diplomatic win. And that is not what happened. According to Al Jazeera's reporting from just hours ago when the 3-day pause expired, negotiators from both countries had failed to finalize an agreement despite 3 additional days of talks in Washington. The deadline came and went at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time, and this time there was no extension. The 50% tariffs actually took effect, hitting close to $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. Prime Minister Carney's response was direct. He said Canada would match the American tariffs dollar for dollar. He also pushed back gently on the idea that the failure represented Canada walking away from progress, stating that in recent weeks, his government had made real headway towards securing what he called the best deal in the world with the United States, but that this progress, in his words, had not been enough to close the gap in time. So, to be precise about where things actually stand as of this recording, the tariff plan didn't collapse in the sense of disappearing. It collapsed in the sense that the diplomatic effort to prevent it failed, and the tariffs the administration had threatened for a month became real. Whether you call that a collapse of the negotiation or an escalation of the trade war likely depends on which side of the border you're standing on. But either way, this is now the most serious tariff confrontation between these two countries since the fight began in February of 2025. It's worth pausing here to talk about who actually feels this, because trade wars can sound abstract until you look at the businesses caught in the middle. According to CNBC, one Canadian business association representing roughly 103,000 members warned that the new Section 338 tariffs could, in the words of one official quoted in that reporting, grind their U.S. sales to a halt if fully implemented. Some businesses reported that American buyers had already started holding off on new orders simply in anticipation of the duties, well before they even took effect. A spokesperson for that association noted that these tariffs strike directly at small business trade between the two countries, because so many of the targeted products, wine, dairy, vehicles, hockey sticks, cement, are consumer-facing goods produced by small and mid-sized firms, not just large multinational manufacturers. There's also a broader social dimension to this story that's easy to miss if you're only following the tariff headlines. According to Wikipedia's documented timeline and corroborating reporting, a significant boycott movement emerged in Canada beginning in early 2025, driven partly by the tariffs themselves and partly by separate comments from President Trump about Canada's sovereignty that many Canadians found deeply unsettling. Polling cited in that reporting found that 91% of Canadians wanted their country to rely less on the United States economically, a figure described by multiple observers as an unprecedented shift in public attitude. In February of 2025 alone, 90% of Canadians said they were following the trade dispute closely, a level of public engagement with a single news story that reporting compared to the intensity Canadians showed during the COVID-19 pandemic. That context matters, because it means the political pressure on Prime Minister Carney to hold firm against further concessions isn't coming only from trade economists and industry lobbyists. It's coming from an unusually engaged Canadian public that has, by multiple measures, grown far more skeptical of its largest trading partner than at almost any point in modern history. It's also worth noting how unusual Trump's own public framing of these tariffs has been throughout this saga, because it's part of why so many analysts describe this relationship as unpredictable rather than merely adversarial. He has, at various points over the past year and a half, threatened tariffs, paused them, doubled them, then backed off the doubling within hours, often responding directly to a single provincial policy or a single social media post from a Canadian official. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has repeatedly served as the point person walking these threats back in real time, negotiating directly with figures like Ontario's Doug Ford, even while broader federal level talks between Washington and Ottawa continued on a separate track. That pattern, a threat, a market reaction, then a partial reversal, has repeated itself often enough that some Canadian officials and business groups have started treating each new tariff announcement with a degree of caution about whether it will actually stick, rather than assuming full implementation is inevitable. This week's actual imposition of the Section 338 tariffs breaks from that pattern in one important way. Unlike the steel and aluminum whiplash back in March, this time the deadline passed, the 3-day extension expired, and the tariffs went into effect anyway, rather than being walked back at the last moment. That distinction is part of why this particular escalation is being treated as more consequential than some of the earlier back and forth. There's one more thread worth untangling here, because it often gets confused with the CUSMA loophole but is actually a separate front in this broader tariff story, the so-called de minimis exemption. According to CNBC, a federal trade court recently upheld the Trump administration's move to close what had been a different kind of loophole entirely, an exemption that allowed low-value packages, generally under a certain dollar threshold, to enter the United States without incurring tariffs at all. This exemption had been heavily used by e-commerce companies, including well-known platforms that ship large volumes of inexpensive goods directly to individual American consumers. According to that same reporting, some larger companies had set up warehouses in Canada and Mexico specifically to break shipments into smaller individual packages, allowing them to slip under the de minimis threshold regardless of where the underlying goods were actually manufactured. President Trump, reacting to the trade court's ruling in a social media post, called it what he described as a big win, characterizing the de minimis exemption as one of the most damaging loopholes in American trade policy, and claiming it had been exploited not just by tariff avoidance schemes, but by criminals shipping illegal goods into the country. It's worth noting, though, that economists cited in that same reporting warned the closure of this exemption could disproportionately affect lower-income American consumers, who rely on inexpensive imported goods for everyday purchases, a trade-off that received far less attention than the political framing around it. Why mention this alongside the CUSMA story? Because together, these two loopholes, the broad CUSMA compliance exemption and the narrower de minimis exemption, represent the two biggest structural leaks in the Trump administration's overall tariff strategy heading into this year. One was mostly closed by court ruling. The other, the much larger CUSMA exemption, has only been closed in the narrow set of sectors covered by the new Section 338 tariffs: dairy, alcohol, and automobiles. The vast majority of Canadian trade with the United States, the other, roughly 80% or so of goods not covered by these specific proclamations, likely still benefits from CUSMA compliance, meaning the fundamental structural loophole behind this entire saga remains largely intact, even after this week's escalation. That's an important nuance because it means this fight is very likely not over. The scheduled 2026 review of the CUSMA agreement that Oxford Economics' Tony Stillo warned about earlier is still on the horizon. If that review results in a weakening or elimination of the compliance exemptions that have shielded the bulk of Canadian trade throughout this entire conflict, the current 50% tariffs on dairy, alcohol, and automobiles could end up looking like a preview of something much larger. A scenario where the full weight of existing tariffs, without any of the current carve-outs or exemptions, lands on the Canadian economy all at once. That's the worst-case outcome analysts have been flagging, and this week's failed negotiations in Washington do nothing to make that scenario less likely. Let's be honest about what remains uncertain here, because a story this fluid deserves that kind of transparency. It is not yet clear, based on available reporting, exactly what specific concessions either side offered during the failed 3-day negotiation window, or precisely why the talks broke down in the final hours. Trump's claim that Canada had essentially eliminated its tariffs going into the U.S. was made before the deal was ever finalized. And it's worth remembering that he explicitly qualified that statement at the time, noting it remained subject to the finalization of documents that, as of the failed deadline, were evidently never finalized. Carney's public statements have consistently used cautious language, phrases like substantial progress and important work still to be done, language that, in retrospect, appears to have accurately signaled that a final agreement was far from guaranteed. It's also worth flagging that some of the granular details about which specific Canadian trade barriers were or weren't addressed during these talks have not been independently confirmed by both governments simultaneously, meaning parts of the public narrative around this negotiation rely on statements from one side or the other rather than a jointly confirmed record. To recap the sourcing behind everything in this script, the details on the initial 2025 tariff escalation, the 35% tariff letter, and the broader trade war timeline come from contemporaneous news reporting and documented public records. The Supreme Court ruling in Learning Resources versus Trump and its impact on IEEPA-based tariffs is drawn from financial and legal reporting on that decision. The Section 338 proclamations, their scope, and their 30-day implementation window come directly from a White House fact sheet and a legal alert from the law firm Wiley. The CUSMA compliance loophole and the 90% tariff-free figure come from Global News reporting citing you. Census Bureau data, along with on-record comments from trade lawyer William Pellerin and Oxford economics Tony Stillo. The 3-day pause, Trump's and Carney's statements around it, and the subsequent breakdown of talks come from CNN, CNBC, NPR, Bloomberg, and Al Jazeera, reporting from the past week. The de minimis exemption closure comes from CNBC's coverage of the federal trade court ruling, where a claim rests on a single social media statement from President Trump rather than independently verified government data, such as his characterization of Canada's tariffs being, in his words, non-existent. That distinction has been flagged clearly rather than presented as confirmed fact. So where does that leave things, heading into whatever comes next between Washington and Ottawa? The tariff plan built around Section 338 didn't quietly fade away, and it didn't get fully blocked by a court the way the earlier IEEPA tariffs did. But it also didn't achieve a clean, uncontested win either. Instead, it ran headlong into a structural loophole, the CUSMA compliance exemption, that had already been shielding the vast majority of Canadian trade for well over a year, forced negotiators back to the table under enormous time pressure, produced a fragile 3-day pause that ultimately fell apart. It ended with the tariffs actually taking effect while Canada moves to retaliate dollar for dollar. Whether you frame that as the tariff plan collapsing under the weight of Canada's structural advantage, or as Canada's negotiating position collapsing under the weight of genuinely unprecedented use of a 70-year-old trade law, probably depends on which government's press release you read first. If you've made it this far, you're clearly the kind of viewer who wants the full picture rather than just the headline. And honestly, that's exactly why channels like this exist. Trade disputes like this one rarely resolve in a single news cycle. They shift, stall, and reignite over months, and the CUSMA review alone means this story is almost certainly not finished. If you want to actually follow where it goes next, rather than piecing it together from scattered headlines later, subscribing is the easiest way to do that. There's more analysis coming as the CUSMA review process moves forward, and as both governments respond to this week's breakdown. So if that's useful to you, staying subscribed means you won't have to go looking for it. There's also a bigger question sitting underneath all of this, and it's one worth thinking about beyond just this single dispute. When a trade agreement's own compliance rules end up functioning as a shield against a country's own tariff strategy, does that represent the agreement working exactly as it was designed to, protecting integrated supply chains from unilateral disruption? Or does it represent a loophole that undermines the entire point of imposing tariffs in the first place? Reasonable people, including the trade economists and officials quoted throughout this script, genuinely disagree on that question. If you found this breakdown useful, a subscribe helps make sure the follow-up on the CUSMA review and whatever happens next between these two governments actually reaches you when it happens, rather than getting lost in a feed full of noise. So here's the real question I want to leave you with. Is a 90-year-old trade law forcing its way through modern trade agreements the sign of a president finally closing a real loophole? Or is it proof that the loophole was always bigger than any single law could actually close? Drop your take in the comments, because this is genuinely one of those disputes where the economic data and the political framing point in noticeably different directions. If you want to keep following how this plays out between Washington and Ottawa in the weeks ahead, subscribing means you'll catch the next development as soon as it breaks, rather than hearing about it secondhand. That's where things stand for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.